We have several speakers, and I'm particularly pleased to welcome alongside my co-researchers Matija Tomanovic from the National Education Union, which funded the project. Professor Joanne Bird could not, fortunately, attend the event tonight, but she just sent us her best wishes. Now, this evening, we hope we can stimulate discussion on the issues raised in our report. I will begin with a short introduction to the project, and then my colleagues, Dr. Jude Brady and Dr. Sarah Pearce, will talk about insights from the findings of the survey and interviews. Professor Howard Stevenson, the co-investigator, will present findings from our case study of Oak National Academy, and then we'll hear from Matija before we open the floor to questions and discussion. So that's the plan for the evening. Now, a couple of things something about the project. The aim of our project was to establish the extent of the use of standardized curricula across English primaries and secondary schools, and to understand the relationship between the use of such curricula and teachers and the quality of teachers' working lives, and in particular their perceptions of autonomy, self-efficacy, and workload. By standardized curricula, in unit schemes, packages, programs that are ready for teachers to follow in teaching. And of course, the use of such curriculum is not new, but it is, we found, extensive, likely growing, and emerging in new forms. Several drivers behind this expansion: the national curriculum in 2014, standardization, the accountability agenda, for example, progression of some of these drivers. In our research, we found that they were used differently in primary and secondary settings. They were used in a variety of ways, a continuum from loose and flexible to packages that closely adhere to standardized curriculum design. So today there has been very little research that looks at teachers' experiences of using this curricula, and we think it is potentially a rich field of research. In terms of methodology, we carried out a survey of 1,655 classroom teachers and middle leaders working in English mainstream schools, nationals included, interviews with 40 teachers, 21 individual, 19 in focus groups. We also carried out analysis of policy documents and curriculum materials. The sample was drawn from the membership of the National Education Union. As I said earlier on, we carried out a study of Oak National Academy as a publicly funded scheme. So that's enough from me. I'll pass it on to Jude now. I'll ask Jude now to talk about the results from some of the results from the survey, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. Hello, everyone. Just bear with me one moment while I get some slides up so you can see some of the findings. Right, okay. Great, thank you. Okay, so I worked on the survey aspect of this study that Anna has just described. And as Anna mentioned, colleagues at the NEU, they distributed an online survey link to NEU members who were tagged as teachers or middle leaders in mainstream schools in England. And we were really pleased to get back 1,655 complete questionnaire responses. When we looked at who'd responded, we found that the respondents very closely reflected the characteristics of the teacher workforce in England. However, they were not claiming a representative sample because they were all NEU members. And we asked in this questionnaire about some key things. We wanted to find out about the extent of standardised curricular use, and we wanted to understand if there was an association between using these curricula in the whole variety of forms that Anna mentioned, and teacher autonomy, teacher self-efficacy, specifically their feelings about their ability to engage and instruct pupils. And the final thing we were interested in was teachers' workload perceptions and trying to understand if using standardised curricula was associated with improved or perhaps worsened perceptions of workload. So what did we find? Well, we found extensive use of standardised curricula. I was really surprised to realise that 90% of the teachers who responded at primary level had followed some form of standardised curricula in the past 12 months. That fell to 54% at secondary. And there was a small number, 53 teachers who worked in mixed age schools, 68% of whom said that yes, they had followed standardised curricula in the past 12 months. In terms of the most popular programmes, at primary, it was White Rose Maths and Power Maths, which I believe is a collaboration between Pearce and White Rose. Then we've got the literacy programme, Read, Write, Ink, coming in second. And then the third most popular form of standardised curricula was those curricula that had been developed within the school or perhaps within the trust. And teachers could, especially at primary level, they could say often they had used or were using more than one form of standardised curricula. Then a different picture at secondary. The huge majority of teachers were following standardised curricula that had been developed by the school or trust. And then in second place, we had White Rose or Power Maths, but you'll see that only 43 of the 449 teachers identified that they were following that curricula. And then Oak National Academy was in third place, but it was only 30 teachers who said at secondary level that they were using that. So with regards to those findings about autonomy, self-efficacy and workload, so we looked at the standardised curricula users and we found that at both levels, primary and secondary, they had lower levels of autonomy compared to peers who were not following these curricula. Then with regards to self-efficacy, for the secondary teachers only, found that they had lower self-efficacy and were able to engage and instruct students effectively if they were following standardised curricula. And then thirdly, I found this quite interesting, there was absolutely no significant difference in workload perceptions for teachers, regardless of whether they were using standardised curricula. And perhaps we might have expected that teachers might feel better about the workload if they had kind of ready-made curricula to deliver, but it's not the case. Okay, I put another slide so you can see a bit more detail. There's two figures on the left, it's primary, on the right, it's secondary. And just to explain, these are all the key variables: autonomy, each type of self-efficacy and workload perceptions. And they've all got a number on. It's been rescaled from 1 to 10, where 10 is high and 1 is low. So 10 out of 10 autonomy would be very high. If it's got a red circle, that means that there was a significant difference between the standardised curricula and non-standardised curricula group, which is what I was trying to explain in the previous slide. So something that might like you your eyes start to adjust and take in some of the detail here. Workload perceptions. I was really shocked at how low they were across the board. Very, very poor workload perceptions at primary and secondary level, both for those who use standardised curricula and who do not use standardised curricula. So there's a kind of really broad, big overview of findings. So in summary, essentially what we found was extensive use of standardised curricula and association with lower levels of autonomy for secondary teachers, lower autonomy and self-efficacy, and yet there doesn't seem to be any improvements in terms of workload perceptions for teachers who are using these curricula. So I will stop there and leave you with that overview of the survey findings.
So looking at the interviews then, as Anna said, we interviewed 40 teachers, about half of them in focus groups and half of them individually. And these are the questions that we asked them. The original plan was to ask that first group of questions of the focus group teachers and the second group of the individual interviews. In reality, it didn't quite work like that, and that most teachers were very happy to talk about the organisation within the school as well as their kind of the sort of micro level lesson planning in their classrooms as well. So some general points before I want to share some of the interview data with you. All of the teachers we spoke to felt that some level of standardisation was necessary. Nobody was saying, I want to just totally do my own thing. Some people talked about the fact that was kind of a mythical period when, it never really existed, where people just did their own thing, but there is a sort of a myth around that. They didn't want that. Nobody wanted that. They all agreed that some level of consistency, some level of equity was necessary, some level of standardisation. It was the extent of the standardisation that was causing problems. We also interviewed a few teachers who enjoyed significant autonomy over the planning and teaching in their classrooms. So it was, as long as we're meeting our learning outcomes, as long as we're sticking to the national curriculum, we can more or less do what we want. We work in teams, we plan together. That was still a model that existed, but it was very much the minority. The majority of the teachers that we spoke to talked about significant levels of control over their planning and teaching, and that it had that level of control had grown fairly quickly over the last 3 or 4 or 5 years. So this is many of you will be familiar with this scenario, but this is the kind of thing that we're talking about. So when we asked them, what do your lessons look like? These are the kinds of typical answers that we got. So that very formulaic retrieval introduction, my turn, our turn, your turn. Everything's split up into very small chunks. Some teachers talking about booklets with 1 lesson per page. So very, very, very tightly structured. And thinking about how the consequences of that level of control over decision making in the curriculum, we found these kind of themes arising from what the teachers were telling us. So probably the most common, the biggest concern that teachers had was the loss of autonomy to adapt the lessons to meet the needs and the interests of their students. That was their number one concern. They were also worried about their own sense of themselves as teachers, not being able to teach in the way that they believed was right. There was a lot of talk about loss of trust, loss of ownership, and de-skilling. So teachers were very aware of the kind of what's happening to the profession in terms of erosion of skills. So I'm just going to give you a very brief snapshot of what that looked like in terms of what the teachers were actually saying to us across those 4 categories. So I'm just going to see if I can move June in. So 2 teachers gave these examples in terms of a lack of autonomy. We asked the question, what happens when you know the students in your class haven't understood the content of that lesson? Do you redo that lesson as it was? Do you adapt it? Or do you just move on? And the head teacher said, you just move on. You go on to the next slide, basically. And similarly, an English teacher said every single English teacher up and down the corridor will be doing the same PowerPoint at the same time. An SLT would look in and say, are you on slide 8 yet? Are you on slide 9 yet? Which was just terrific. You click the subtitle. And this was not a unique case. Several teachers said exactly the same thing. That there was a certain pride in senior leadership that they could look into the windows of various classrooms and see exactly the same thing in parallel lessons. And then in terms of lack of individual self-efficacy, it's going to let Alison. In terms of lack of individual self-efficacy, this primary teacher is again talking about the same thing here, talking about it's all about coverage. It's all about have you jumped through the hoops rather than have the children learned anything. What she's also reflecting on here is how things have changed from when she began her career. She used to think, what do I want the children to be able to do, to consolidate, to have experienced as part of my lesson based on the national curriculum. Now it's about what you do in your lesson rather than the results of your lesson, rather than what have the children learnt. It's all about, have you shown this slide? Have you stuck in this worksheet? Have you said these words? In some cases, reading from the script that goes with the PowerPoint. So that what this teacher is articulating, as well as that issue of coverage, it's about coverage rather than learning, is the sense of herself as a teacher is being really eroded, that she knows what's right and she's not able to do it, so that lack of self-efficacy. And then there's a concept of collective self-efficacy as well, so what's happening to the teaching profession as a whole. And this teacher, many teachers address this, but I think this teacher did so in the most articulate way. This idea that stress, I looked into stress and discovered that stress wasn't necessarily being caused by workload. It's also being caused by a lack of professional freedom and a sense of overwhelm, not being able to, take ownership of what we do anymore, or what we teach, or how we teach. And I think that's a really articulate way of framing this idea that workload has been oversimplified. It's not about the amount of hours that you're doing, it's about how much control you have over what you're doing. And that's what causes the burnout, that's what causes the stress, not so much the hours that you work in. And then de-skilling. Many teachers talked about de-skilling of the profession as a whole, not only their own individual de-skilling, but de-skilling of the profession. And I borrowed this concept from Michael Apple here, atrophy. It's just things are just withering on the mind because they're not being attended to. So several teachers talked about continuing professional development. It's not there. The actual subject knowledge, nobody seems to worry about. And then many teachers talked, and we didn't ask questions about ECTs, we didn't ask questions about initial teacher education, but many teachers came to us with this issue of, we're worried about initial teacher training, we're worried about ECTs coming to us, and all they want to know is where's the PowerPoint, rather than how can I plan my learning. I think the individual taking responsibility for the learning that you're going to deliver to the young people is being diminished, says the science teacher. And then very trenchantly, this is the final quote there, if all you're doing is changing the slides on a PowerPoint and reading from the script, you do not need qualified teacher status. A lot of teachers saying, we're really worried about the profession, because if we're bringing in standardised curriculum for every single subject, then there's a real possibility there of moving away from having highly qualified teachers in the classroom. You don't need them because you've got a script. And then we finally asked whether that question that Jude was touching on there about whether standardised curriculum reduced workload, and two of the teachers that gave the response here, this was a very common response. Well, yes, if you just want to rock up and read from the PowerPoint, that's going to reduce your workload, but that's not teaching. And the second teacher there is less lesson planning, but there's also less ownership. We're just delivering. So yes, there may be less workload, but the trade-off in terms of lack of satisfaction, that lack of a sense that you're meeting the needs of your students is not worth it for many of the teachers in our study. And then several teachers are saying things like, well, you have to do so much adapting to those standardised curriculum that you might as well start from the beginning anyway. And then other teachers saying kind of crazy things like you have to rebadge them. You have to change the format and add the school badge to everything. So in fact, what looked like time saved is actually time lost on these nonsense kind of titivating activities. Sorry, that's the last one. So that's a whistle stop of some of the things that the teachers were saying in the interviews. I'm passing to Howard, I believe.
Yeah, if you could.
Sorry, I can't be with you in person, but it's great to have this opportunity to talk about the work that we've been doing. I'm going to follow on from Jude and Sarah by talking specifically about Oak National Academy. And I'll say a little bit about the background to that, because particularly for anybody who's outside of England or even the UK, it might not be clear what Oak is. But you will have seen from Jude's slides that Oak is one of the standardised curricula packages that are used by teachers. Oak is distinctive. It emerged during the period of the pandemic, and it was a group of teachers who got together and developed resources and sought to make them available to teachers during the pandemic, people who'd moved to remote teaching, and everyone desperate really to sort of develop resources that they hadn't of the sort that they hadn't been using previously. And that's how Oak initially developed. But post-pandemic, the government of the time chose to further sort of support Oak on a longer term basis. And in 2022, 2023, committed £43 million to the continuation of Oak, expecting that it would develop the sorts of resources that it had been developing during the pandemic as a full suite of resources across the primary and secondary curriculum and across all national curriculum subjects. So Oak had developed, in a sense, into an organisation that was going to produce a sort of what you might call a sort of super standardised curriculum. This would be freely available so a freely available resource identified and linked to the national curriculum. The business case that the Department for Education put together to make the case for the investment in Oak, and it's a very illuminating document. The business case that the Department for Education put together identified two main problems within the English education system that Oak was in due course intended to be a response to. So the two main problems was, one, a weakness in curriculum design and delivery. This was sort of particularly linked, I think, to the introduction of the 2014 national curriculum, but there was a view that teachers' design and delivery of the curriculum was inadequate. And the evidence base for this was largely based on Ofsted reports. The other main problem within the English education system was identified as excessive teacher workload, and, quote from the business case, associated with curriculum planning. Now, it's not clear what the evidence base is to say. I mean, teacher workload is a widely acknowledged problem. Picking out curriculum planning as the sort of principal cause of the problems seemed a little bit peculiar, but that is the case presented in the DfE's business case. So in a sense, teachers were presented as lacking the skills to engage in proper curriculum design and delivery. And they were also, in a sense, being accused of being inefficient. The sort of language used in the business case was that teachers were reinventing the wheel frequently in terms of how they designed and delivered curriculum. And the solution, therefore, was that teachers needed to be provided with sort of high quality curriculum materials, apparently the sorts of materials that they weren't able to develop themselves. And these needed to be free and easily accessible to teachers. Now, how to do this? The DfE acknowledged that it was not its role to do this, mainly because it recognised that teachers would not trust the Department for Education to produce curriculum materials. So one response was to produce these materials and produce them from the DfE, and the DfE recognised that it wasn't sufficiently trusted for that to be a realistic proposition. But interestingly, the DfE also didn't trust private providers, educational publishers, for example, to produce those materials either, because they didn't believe that those providers could be trusted, as it were, to maintain a sort of strategic alignment with the government's curricular objectives. So what the business case for Oak did was identify Oak as the solution to this problem. It wasn't the DfE. The branding of Oak was something that had been developed by teachers for teachers. And so the argument was it could get the buy-in from the teaching profession, whilst also remaining strategically aligned to the government and its objectives. So Oak would be developed as an independent organisation, but strategically aligned to the DfE and its objectives. Oak sort of fitted the bill in terms of what the DfE was looking for, partly based on Oak's own claims, based on its own independent research, that using Oak materials had a dramatic impact on teachers' workload. Oak claimed a 4-hour a week reduction in teachers' workload. It claimed improved well-being for teachers who used Oak materials. It suggested that teachers who used Oak materials were less likely to quit. And it also suggested that there was a positive impact on on student attainment. So Oak, in a sense, was presenting a sort of powerful case for the contribution it could make to the system. The business case that the DfE then presented for supporting Oak was that it was capable of providing a high quality curriculum package. A sort of key theme of this business case is that teachers were not adequately designing and developing and planning curricula. And what they needed, in a sense, was a package that was provided for them. So one of the key objectives of Oak was to provide that sort of coherent curriculum package. Another objective was to be a resource in the event of, for example, another pandemic. If there was a requirement to move to remote teaching, that resource would be available in the future. The business case talked about stretching materials, providing stretching materials for all four nations within the UK. And that, in a sense, is quite interesting because, of course, curricular issues are devolved to individual nations. So it's not sort of clear, in a sense, why the DfE would want Oak's materials to have an applicability across all four nations. It's something that's very seldom talked about in curriculum terms, but was part of the business case. And then a sort of final element was to develop Oak as a sort of respected brand, sort of by teachers, for teachers, but critically, strategically aligned, independent from government, but strategically aligned with it. So that was the business case, only partly really revolving around the need to develop materials in the event of a shift to remote teaching. Quite a lot of the case for Oak being other issues around the delivery of the 2014 national curriculum. Now, the way we analysed Oak, and we did focus on it because it's got public money, it's distinctive in that case, and I think there is a sort of special case for arguing that we needed to sort of have a focus on Oak. So what we did was we looked in detail at some of the curriculum materials. I'm not going to talk about that now, but they are there in the report. And if you want to have a look at that analysis, it's there, and I would encourage you to have a look at it. But the surveys and interviews that we've already discussed had a specific sort of Oak focus to them. Now, very briefly, in terms of our findings in relation to Oak, and you'll have picked up some of these things already from for example, the contribution from Jude and the survey, is we actually identified very little use of Oak. Possibly 3% of teachers appeared to be using Oak as part of a curriculum package, right? A larger number of teachers had used Oak in some way, but when we sort of looked at that further, it was actually quite occasional use in very specific circumstances. So what appeared to be the case was that rather than use Oak as a sort of coherent curriculum package across a whole sort of scheme of work, teachers were sort of typically using Oak to fill in for lessons where the teacher might be absent, to fill in for situations where maybe the student had experienced absence, or to support teachers who were teaching outside of their area of curriculum expertise. But as I say, our findings were that the use of OAK was really quite limited, and where it was being used, it was being used on an occasional basis. I've indicated that OAK made some quite dramatic claims about workload, 4 hours a week, reduced workload for teachers using OAK materials. Jude has indicated that our data showed no discernible difference between teachers using standardised curricula and not using standardised curricula. And within those using standardised curricula, frankly, the numbers who were using OAK materials were so small, we couldn't really make any claims about the impact of OAK on workload. The numbers were just too small. I mean, what we speculate in the report is if the numbers were as dramatic as OAK claimed, we might expect a much higher use of OAK materials, but actually that wasn't the case. So just sort of headline conclusions. Our assessment is that OAK is not widely used as the standardised curriculum package, that some of OAK's claims about usage did not align with what our data suggested. The OAK materials are mostly used as a sort of an infill in particular contingent circumstances. That many of the claims that OAK make, our evidence found it difficult to support. And what was very clear was that in the business case, where the Department for Education clearly took the view that the development of materials by OAK was this opportunity to create a sort of curriculum package that teachers would follow in toto, as it were. And this was posed as an alternative to what was characterized as happening, which was teachers sort of pick resources from here and there, a sort of pick and mix sort of approach. Well, actually, what our evidence suggested is that is actually exactly how teachers are using OAK materials. Teachers are not using OAK materials as part of a continuous, coherent curriculum package. They are literally picking and mixing in situations where there's a teacher absent, maybe there's a sort of gap in a program of work, and they pick around and they pick up something from OAK and they insert it into what they're doing. But it's absolutely, it's very clear that it's not being used in any way as the business case that the DFE presented for the original investment was intended. And so on that basis, one has to question whether this has been a good use of public money. But I'm going to finish there, and we'll happily pick up questions in the discussion. Thanks, Anna.
Thank you, Howard. Thanks to Sarah for your contributions. Can I ask Matthew to speak?
Yeah, sure.
Next.
Thanks very much, and yeah, thanks for your contributions so far. My name is Matthew. I work in the campaigns team at the National Education Union, who, as I say, commissioned this report. So I do want to make clear, I'm not an academic. I'm not here to speak to the academic research, but I guess just wanted to offer a few thoughts on why we commissioned the report, what we plan to kind of do with it, and put it in the context of wider, our members' priorities more broadly. I think, as it's been covered somewhat already, the report came about, I think, because of the introduction of OAK, and a lot of our members are very concerned about the impact of that on their autonomy and sense of professionalism. So we wanted to kind of meet. That's something that comes up often. We wanted to meet our members where they were and give them, support some of those conversations and organising work that's happening. I guess I wanted to zoom out a little bit and say that there are frequent concerns about the kind of the standardisation of teaching. And I think that they're related to other concerns that we often hear from our members. So there's a lot of discontent, for example, around the use of standardised assessments in primary schools. The GCSE reforms of the last decade. We hear often about the impact of child poverty on the nature of teachers' jobs, so food banks being set up, hygiene banks, etc. And so this isn't, I guess what I'm trying to say is there's something about the changing role of teachers and of the profession that's important to our members, and it's important to us as an organisation for kind of more existential reasons in terms of, you know, teachers there are the few members we have. And I think that those issues are linked. And I guess kind of related to that, I would, we talked a bit about de-skilling. And I think that if you take the concerns around the impact of standardised curricula on professionalism, in tandem with some of those other things, the impact of the accountability system, the impact of standardised assessments, and of rising child poverty, what all of those things speak to is a sense of alienation in the profession from the reasons that they got involved in teaching, the things that on a day-to-day basis motivate them, and the things that they find interesting and stimulating about the profession. And something about that I think is really important, not just because it's happening in the teaching profession, but I think you see a mirror of that actually among students. So there's a huge, you know, one of the big debates in the kind of policy sector at the moment is about, education policy sector is about mental health and well-being, and you know, the government's response to that is mental health practitioners in every school, and that's great. You know, we're nothing against that at all, but we're not engaging with the substantive question of why is it that there was a report by Impetus, which is a charity that I don't think can be classed as massively, you know, on the left if you were to look at the political spectrum in that way. They interviewed a bunch of students and they were all saying schools are a means to an end. We don't see the need to go anymore. And so I do think it's important to see this report and the kind of work around this in that context of there's a broader question about what is the role of a teacher, and that's within a broader question of what's the role of the education system, what kind of experience are our children receiving. And I guess the third kind of like dimension of that I think links those things for our members is, and I think that all of the contributors so far have mentioned it, is about control. So the business case for Oak sets out some reasonable sounding objectives, but ultimately it's about policymakers' needs to be able to measure and see success, and that involves a degree of control over what's being taught and how it's being taught. And that's true in those other kind of areas that we think about often, like accountability and Ofsted and assessment as well, I think. So yeah, in terms of why we commissioned this work and why I think it's really important, as I say, we're trying to meet a kind of a member need and wanted to understand better the self-reported kind of conversations and things that come up from our membership in terms of the impacts of standardised curriculum packages on teacher professionalism, because it started with Oak, but as I think the report found, there's loads of other standardised curriculum packages in use, more so than it. It's also a contribution to trying to challenge the direction of travel in education policy on a more ideological level. I think kind of something we've been sucked into as a sector in the kind of think tank and charity world is kind of engaging with policy issues on a very surface level. What works, what's evidence-based, you know, and I'll talk, you know, the curriculum assessment review is a good example. We're talking about, well, what should and shouldn't be taught. We're not talking about what is a curriculum and what, you know, how that's kind of delivered. But also, you know, what we want to, I think, to recognise is that issues around teacher professionalism are industrial issues. I think historically you think of trade union issues as pay, workload, maternity issues, that like kind of those kind of traditional industrial issues. Actually, as the nature of the profession is changing, we need to engage with these questions. And as a trade union, we need to engage them on an industrial level. The nature of people's jobs changing, and that is leading to some pretty significant outcomes in terms of improving retention, children's well-being, etc. And so this piece of work is helping us to contribute to that and helping us move forward in terms of how we mobilise our members, to kind of challenge these issues, particularly if there's MAP level, multi-academy trust level standardised curriculum packages. I could talk a bit more about that because we've got a good example. I won't now, that people have questions after. Because there's a MAT in East of England where we're working on exactly these issues. I guess the last thing I want to say is just to kind of like focus a bit on why, as I work in a campaigns team, why is this kind of politically important right now? So, and why we published the report when we did, and kind of what we've done with it from our side at the NEU. As people will know, the government launched an independent review of curriculum and assessment, which is due to report in October, we've heard. And that was a huge opportunity, I think, to make some, to kind of address some of the kind of impacts of the logic of the Gove reforms, and beyond. And that's kind of how it was framed. But what we didn't get is any kind of political agreement or direction on what we want out of the education system. So if you read the terms of reference of the report, they mention outcomes like closing the disadvantage gap, but it doesn't mention what does our democratically elected political leadership want the education system to be. And so from my perspective, the impact of that is that it means that the logic of the Gove reforms was baked into that review, and it means that the terms of the debate are extremely limited in terms of what is possible in terms of the outcomes of the review and the recommendations that the panel will make. And so I think it's incumbent on us, and it's really important that we do this work of asking the question that they never asked, which is what is a curriculum? It's not just what's the content that's being taught, but teachers are the conduit through which that's happening, and they have an impact on how that's delivered in schools. And so we need to engage with that question for that reason as well. The very last thing I want to say is just because Howard was talking about OAK, which clearly isn't being used very often, but why is that important in the context of the curriculum assessment review? Well, 3 out of 12 of the review panel members are either going to be phase leads or on the board of OAK. So this is something that the government's poured tens of millions into, that every teacher knows is available and they're not using, but the people that are behind it are driving the curriculum reforms that will be defining what the next generation of children and teachers are going to deal with in schools. So it's extremely important that we engage with these issues. And I know Warwick's on the course has some excellent work in terms. I won't speak about what what that means, why there's 3 people from OAK out of 12 in the panel. It would point people to Warwick's work about the kind of who is involved in policy making in the education sector. So yeah, just to say thanks for having me, and also thanks for what I think is a brilliant report, and our members received really well. We launched the report at the NEU at our annual conference, which is in March or April, I can't remember, April. And the fringe meeting that we held it at was absolutely rammed. I've never seen an annual conference fringe that full. We had to turn people away at the door. People were standing at the back. I think that just speaks to how important this is to our members. So yeah.
Very well, thank you. Thanks for your input. Thanks for the funding as well, to carry out this report. Okay, I think we've got questions, comments coming